Good evening. Here we are in the week of Parsha's KiTetztze. Due to various technical and other difficulties, I decided to do the shiur this week. I hope to get back to the live shiur next week. But I didn't want to pass without doing something again this week. So we have Parsha's KiTetztze, and it discusses the issue of, begins with KiTetztze when you go out to war. Interesting that even though this is ostensibly the Parsha of going to war, really most of the halachas having to do with war were more spoken about last week in the Parsha, which was Shoftim, which one might say was the Parsha that sets out what we need to do as a governmental body of our own nation, electing a king, Sanhedrin, the laws of how to deal with people who are trying to ruin society, people who are trying to inir any dachas, even in Egla Arufa at the end, which is the responsibility that we have to make sure that tragedies don't occur within our communities, that we take responsibility for those things outside of our community. But in this week's Parsha, it's KiTetztze when you go out to war. But really the topic is not so much about the war, but the aftermath of the war. The soldier comes home, and during the wartime, he met a beautiful captive, a woman from the other side, from the enemy, who caught his fancy, and he wants to take her home and have her be with him, and the halachas related to that. And it's a very unusual halacha that he's allowed to have her, even though she's not Jewish. She's supposed to convert. There's all sorts of questions. Halachically, is he allowed to have her before she converts? Is he allowed to have her once before she converts? Is the whole idea that she should convert? And is it a good idea at all? Rashi famously says that the sequence of the first three parshas, there's that parsha, then the next one about the man who has two wives, one of whom is hated, followed by the Ben Sora Mora, the wayward son. And Rashi brings out in a famous Gemara that if a person takes an Isha Sifas Torah, marries this beautiful woman for the wrong reasons, he will end up hating her. And of course, a child who grows up from parents who hate each other, there's a good chance they're not going to be such successful children and will have a Ben Sora Mora. But so that for that reason, this halacha that is permitted is difficult. The whole idea is difficult. But we're not going to talk so much about the Yifas Torah, but just focus on the fact that it's talking about a soldier who goes to war and kind of the effects that it has on him and how he comes back from the war. That's interesting because, in all the debates here in Israel about the draft for Charedim, so I heard one wag say that in last week's Parsha, it talks about going out to war and worrying about if the person is going to have their spiritual standard, the famous section there which speaks about that somebody is going, and even if they have small averos, they could go away from the war because they shouldn't have a negative effect on others. So if you go to the war, the army, you go as a tzaddik, and now they came to the war, to the army, and he came back home, and he's with the Yifas Torah, which proves that going to the army is going to ruin him and his spiritual status. Okay, I think that's pretty out there. Obviously not maybe more of a cynical view than anything real. But it is interesting to look at, in general, what the Torah looks at as far as the halachas that have to do with war in the previous Parsha and the halachas that are in this Parsha. So before we go more in depth, I want to, and much of what I had to say tonight is based on a shiur I heard from a Rebbe of mine many years ago, Rav Alon, and he sets it out as follows. If you gather all of the various discussions that are even very peripherally related to war, let's look at them all very briefly together, all the ones that are in this week's Parsha. There is the Parsha of Yifas Torah we just looked at. little bit later in the Parsha, there's the story of Lo Yavo Amoni Vu Moavi B'Kahal Hashem, that the descendants of Ammon and Moab may not join into the Jewish people even forever. Why? Because they did not greet you with bread and water on your way out of Egypt. And because they hired Bilam to come and curse you. Not really war, but it's kind of related to war because it's talking about our relationships with other nations. And it's interesting that in the case of Ammon and Moab, even though they knew that we were not going to fight them directly, there was a direct command from Hashem that we're not supposed to start war with them. For some reason, this factor that they were ingrates, they were ungrateful for the fact that they only existed because Avram Avinu saved Lot, and Avram was kind to Lot, and Avram was kind to their parents, and they couldn't even do this little kindness. Therefore, they were banned forever. It shows us something about how serious the avera of hakaras, of not having hakaras atov, of being an ingrate, of being not grateful for when people do things for you, how deeply that is. After all, we've had lots of other problems with lots of other nations. For certainly the Egyptians tormented us, etc., but still, they were good to Yosef. They let us live there for a while before they started tormenting us. They don't have as long of a punishment, only a couple of generations. But Ammon and certainly any other nation, many of whom Esav, we've had a lot of problems with. But it didn't go to their essence. The essence of Ammon and Moab was something that we could not tolerate having that amongst us. It is, of course, interesting that the most famous Moabite that did join the Jewish people, because the women were allowed to join, was Ruth. And her defining characteristic was chesed, and actually being kind and being grateful for every little thing that she had, and that is why she was able to turn that around. Okay, anyway, that was so that we had that aspect. Later on in the Parsha, it talks about KiTetztze machane oloyevecha, when you go and you have a camp on your enemies, in other words, a war camp. So what do we have to worry about? To be careful not to enter any negative thing there. And give some examples. What are the things we're worried about? If a man, one of the soldiers, has a seminal emission at night, so he has to go out, can't come back in until he goes to the mikvah, etc. And it's a little strange, First of all, this is wartime. We're so worried about a soldier who had this. What's this halacha doing here? It should be in Vayikra with all the halachas having to do with Tumah and Tahara. But yet, there's a focus here on keeping the war camp a holy place. And in fact, then it goes on to an even another level. You have to make sure there's a shovel available. And you should take that spade with you, and if you go outside and you do your thing in the field, you should dig with it and cover over the waste product that you left there. Anyway, so it says, why is that so? Ki Hashem Elokecha mithalech b'kerev machanecha, because Hashem your God is going in your camp, la'atzilcha, and He wants to save you, la'teit oivecha lefanecha, and to put your enemies down in front of you. Therefore, Or HaChaim Hakadosh, your camp has to be a holy place. And negative things should not be seen there, so Hashem will turn away from you. So, of course, this is a focus on the army and a focus on soldiers, but it's, again, not focusing so much on the army as a whole, but on the effect of the army on the chayal, on the individual soldier, and how he has to live in a place of holiness. And it tells us also, by the way, that an army camp is a holy place. It's a place where Hashem is amongst us. And I think in the war today, even though you hear a lot of other things in other places, much Yiras Shamayim and Kedusha is there amongst the Chayalim and amongst those who are really most nefesh for Am Yisrael. couple of years ago, I had the great privilege of spending a Shabbos in Sderot on an OU mission with Rav Shmuel Eliyahu, and basically spending it with the Chayalim who were fighting, and the amount of incredible heroism, courage, good cheer, but also serious sense of mission of protecting our people and their sense of privilege of being able to do so was something that's just unforgettable. And it's too bad that a lot of people who talk about this topic haven't had that experience and don't understand just how much Hashem is very much with the Chayalim and amongst the Chayalim. Not to take away from that there are problems and there are people who go to the army and lower their spiritual standards. It's certainly true. There's much to be concerned with. However, it is, in most cases, and certainly frameworks can be constructed so that it's only a positive place. Okay. What else did we have in the Parsha having to relate to war? Ki kach isha chadasha lo yitzei batzava v'lo yavor olav l'chol davar. When a man gets married to a new wife, he gets an exemption from the army for 1 year. He doesn't have to go. Naki leveito shana echat. He is naki, he's clean of obligations in terms of the public obligations of the army for Shonim Rishona for that first year. V'simachat ishto asher lakach. He has one job. His job is to make his wife happy. That's a very, very interesting pasuk. V'simachat ishto asher lakach. It does, by the way, it doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that the wife has an obligation to make the husband happy. There's a mitzvah for the husband to make the wife happy. And we learn the mitzvah of Ona from here, that the husband has certain marital obligations. But in general, the husband's supposed to treat his wife such that she is pleased, that she enjoys her relationship with him. And the Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach pointed out that the 1 year obligation is not on the second half on the pasuk; it's only on the first half. Naki eleveso shana echat. That's as far as the army. V'simach es ishto asher lakach. That's for life. One is supposed to try to make one's wife glad. Okay, so that's related to war, but not really. Again, just what he doesn't have to do. And then finally, the end of the Parsha is the famous Parsha Zochar, which talks about the war that we have to do with Amalek, which again is not so much about the war with Amalek, but a description of Amalek's effect on us, and particularly on the individuals. That Amalek seeks to harm all those who go away from the main camp, and that if we become tired and we don't fear Hashem properly, then we will have problems with Amalek, and that someday we will have the mitzvah of eradicating Amalek. That's, of course, there's so much to talk about with that, but we're not going to. Just to mention that those things that we've mentioned here are the matters which have to do with war in this week's Parsha. So what we've seen is that Parshas Shoftim talks about us more as a nation, but Parshas KiTetztze, which interestingly enough is the Parsha which has the most mitzvahs of any Parsha in the Torah, many of them, and particularly the ones we've seen, talk about the individual person. And there's an old Hasidic saying that we have to worry about Klal Yisrael and Reb Yisrael. We have to worry about the whole nation and everything that happens to us, but not to forget about the individual. And the same in the reverse. We have to not focus so much on our individual to the forgetting about our responsibilities towards the Klal. And this transition between Shoftim and KiTetztze sort of, and the different emphasis of the war efforts and what's connected to war, not so much on the war in general, but on the individual soldier and his issue with his moral questions and his ethical questions and his relationship with his wife or with this other woman, even caring for the individuals who straggle for the Amalek. That's more individual, Reb Yisrael. But maybe we can see this perhaps in the context of another mitzvah that plays a big role in this week's Parsha, and we'll learn together some of what the Or HaChaim Hakadosh had to say about that. Okay? And that mitzvah is the interesting mitzvah of Hashavat Aveda, of returning lost objects. This mitzvah already appears in Parshas Mishpatim, very briefly in just one verse, but here it's a very long section telling us about the halachas. And if you think about them, I mean, most of us have learned Elam Etzias and have some idea of Hashavas Aveda. It's often the first, my grandson, Baruch Hashem, is just starting to learn Gemara, and that's just like it was for me so many years ago. The first Gemara I learned, it's the first Gemara he's learning. And so, because it seems to be rather straightforward and rather relatively simple idea, if to return a lost object. But if we look at what's required of us here, it's actually a little bit much. It says, "Lo tired shor achicha et seyo nidachim v'hitalamta mehem hashev teshivim lachicha." You should not see the ox of your brother or his sheep wandering around and v'hitalamta mehem, and you would ignore them. Rather, hashev teshivim, a double lashon, that you should duly return them to your brother. That's the beginning of Perek Chaf Beis in this Parsha. Okay? Now think about it. I don't know how many of you have been to the farm recently and ever seen an ox or a bull. An ox or a bull is a huge animal that weighs probably a few thousand pounds, and it's not that easy to control. And what we're saying over here is that you see the other guy's shore wandering around, and then you have to go over to that shore and try to do what you can to take control of it. It's a lot. So, and it says they're nidachim. They are wandering, they're lost. Reminds us of v'hanidachim ve'eretz Mitzrayim, of people who are kind of lost. And as we'll see, there's a lot of connections here between the animals and people, but let's get to that slowly. What are we supposed to do over here? Hashev teshivim, return them. Chazal tell us, why does it say twice? Afilu mea pamim, even 100 times. If you see every other day the shore wandering around, you have to go. So you try bringing it back. He's not there, right? You couldn't get into his barn. So what are you supposed to do? Right. So the Torah says, right? Torah says, "Im lo karich rova achicha elecha v'lo yidato." If the guy's not near and you don't know where he is, or you don't know who he is, so in the meantime, you can't just let the shore, this huge animal, wander around, but you have to va'asafto al toch beisecha, bring it into your home. I can only imagine what Lonnie would say if I would walk into the house with a big bull. Literally, not that we have a china shop, but that's can't imagine that the house would survive too long. And I don't know, how much you're required to do this if you really can. It's probably in those days most people had some sort of barn in the back or stable for their animals, but it doesn't say that. El toch harefet. It says el toch beitecha. Okay, be a babysitter for it. And it should be with you until the other guy comes looking for it. What do you have to do in the meantime? You have to feed it, to give it drink, until you restore it, and you have to restore it in a way that you're restoring the actual object, the animal. The Gemara has stories about, I think it was Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, who had found some chickens, and they didn't know who they were, brought them home, and the chicken laid eggs, and he realized they're piling up. What's he supposed to do? He can't take them for himself, so he sold them, and he bought a goat with it, or 2 goats eventually. And when the guy came a few months later, he said, "Did you ever happen to see my chickens?" He said, "Here they are." They showed him the goats, because he wanted to give him something that was still worth something. He couldn't give him the chickens. That's what you have to do. It's really not just like what we think. What's Hashavas either? We're very proud of ourselves if we find something, so we put a notice on the board. We're done, right? If somebody calls us, great. If they don't call us, also great. That's not what it says over here. It says to take it into your house, to hold it, okay? And, and really take care of it. Okay? And it says, Lo sucha lehis alem. You cannot ignore it. I don't know what that means. That's a difficult pasuk. I won't go into that now. I'll only mention very briefly that the Alshich says, if you return it again and again and again, of course, initially you could ignore it, but you should bring yourself to the point that it becomes such a part of you that you can't ignore mitzvahs. Just say that very briefly. So that happens, and then right after that, there's another parsha, a very interesting parsha, which says, "Lo tiret chamor achicha o sharo noflim badarech v'hitalamta mehem hakem takim imo." That if you should not see your brother's chamor, his donkey, or his ox, that they're falling, and you just ignore it. You have to help him pick them up. This is different than it says in Mishpatim, where it says chamor sona'acha. Why the chamor of the enemy? Not going to go into now. But it seems, what is that? This is not about a hashavas aveda, it would seem, but rather just to help the other guy out. The guy needs help. You need to help. You have to help him. Try as much as you can help him. But you only have to help him is hakem takim imo. If he is willing to help himself, you have to help him. But you can't. You can't. If he sits there and says, "Oh, you have a mitzvah. Go ahead. I'm going to go home to get a coffee." You're not chayv to do that. Okay. So that's the basic mitzvah. The Or HaChaim here is very, very interesting, and he takes it in a different way. And even though he's writing a little bit, as you could sort of feel under the context about his time, it's very much our time as well, as we shall see. So this is what he says. Parsha zu ba'a liramos befratus. This parsha comes to hint to us something in all the details that it points out, right? V'chiyuv hatochachos shetzrichim b'nei kelchai tzadikei olam lasos la'am Hashem. This is the tochacha that the sons of the living God, who are tzadikim, are supposed to do on behalf of the nation of Hashem. What does it mean by tochacha? He doesn't necessarily mean giving them musar or calling them out, but he means helping them come closer. The word tochacha, hocheach, tochiach really comes from the same word as to prove something, to show something, to show the other person that, in the case of hocheach, tochiach, the error of their ways, not by yelling at them, but to show them there's a better way. You're wasting your time by going in this negative way. And here in the tochacha is that we're supposed to come close to Hashem. And he says it in a very interesting way. He says, V'hein elat tzadikim, they're called achim. These tzadikim are called brothers. Brothers. Brothers of whom? Very interesting. Brothers, he says, and very surprisingly, brothers of Hashem himself. Brothers of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? And he says, when he say achi, that's hamadrega hayoter mu'ula b'chol ha'kinuyim asher yitachnu b'hem yichideyam. The highest thing that you could call a person is not tzaddik or Sarah Torah or goyen or whatever. The highest thing is that you could call a person is that he's an ach to Hashem, that he's a brother to Hashem. V'alehem amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu leman achai v'reyai adar b'nashol bach. And about that we say, Hashem says that for the sake of my brothers. What is that, brothers? Brothers in the sense of one thing that brothers generally have, a little less so today than in the past, but brothers usually had a very shared experience. They grew up in the same home and town, same experiences, and generally would stay in the same place, and etc. They people who are shutafim, who are partners in life to a certain experience, and particularly of Kiddush Hashem. So we have these brothers. He's speaking homiletically. So you see, Shor Achicha O Chamaroto, right? So what are we talking about here? Says the Or HaChaim, very interestingly, that he says, Shor Achicha Eloheim B'nei Adam. Those are people. The ox of God. Your brother. Your brother is Hashem, So his animal, who's his animal? Not the bull, not the ox, but people. Because in this, the allegory is that they are considered like animals, not in a negative sense, but rather they are, like we say, Hoshana's Tzayin Kadosh, right? Hashem's holy sheep. We're called Am Yisrael Nikrat Tzon Kadoshim, and that's why it's called Shor Vaseh. It's like I am Hashem's sheep. I am Hashem's ox. And that's very interesting, by the way, in terms of Korbanos, the people amongst us who are in Daf Yomi world, about to start Kachim, and Rav Hirsch, quoting the Ramban, talks about this often, that when a person would bring an ox, what is an ox? Type of person is an ox? Let's have the characteristics of an ox or a sheep. Let's say the sheep follows the shepherd, the ox is the strong worker. The person wants to, when they offer that up to Hashem as a korban, they're offering that aspect of themselves. That's a tangent I don't want to go on here, but just to the sense of that Shor Achicha Oseyo, the Or HaChaim is saying, is that we're talking about that the tzaddikim have a responsibility if they see the ox or the sheep, i.e. the children of God who are like an ox and a sheep, who are tzon kadashim, and they are nidachim. They are nidachim. What does that mean? They're pushed away, right? As it says, v'nidachta v'hishtachavisa lahem. There's a pasuk that says, talking about when we go off the derech, that we lost our way. The Or HaChaim had an association, of a spiritual association with this. It's a spiritual nidach. We've lost. We're going to a place that's not good. We're going to a place that's not the right place, not close to their true owner, Hashem, our ach, right? So what is the command here is Haveisav Hashem leval yit'alem. We shouldn't ignore this. Ele yeshivem le'achiv hu elokei olam. That it's our responsibility to do what we can to bring them back to our brother who is Hashem, to bring back his straying sheep, him, the God of the world. And it says Hashev Teshivem. Why does it say it twice? Because you should see that these Tzon Kadashim are Hashem's, and he is our brother, and he's like and this shore is like the child of our Father in heaven, and therefore we were supposed to try to do what we can to bring them back. And in 2 stages, he says. First, Hashev, right? Sometimes in the beginning you can't directly talk to a person who's far away, who's really gone quite far from the Jewish roots. You can't sit them down right away and bring them to a Beis Medrash and talk Torah with them. But you can be Hashev. You can bring them back to our values, to the derech of Chesed and Tov and good things, and to be careful about acting in a proper way, and then eventually to bring them back to Torah. That's, by the way, a mistake, I think, that sometimes people who are interested in doing kiruv, including myself very much, have made. I know when we first came to Israel for the first couple of years, we lived in a place called Lavon, where we were the only religious family living in an entirely secular yishuv. And we were advised wrongly, I believe, by some people who were helping an organization that we were involved with, that we have to right away try to bring people to Shabbos and give them Shiur and Torah, and that was not good advice, and it didn't go over well. I was much more impressed with the success of the Garin HaTorani in Migdal HaEmek, who also try to do what they can to spread Torah, but they do it by doing a lot of chesed, by befriending people, by doing good things for people, by making a good name for themselves among people, and people eventually become attracted to them, and then eventually maybe we'll go to the next level of being interested in Torah and learning and Shabbos and Kashrus. That's is first Hashev and then Teshiveh. Anyway, so he says over here, okay, that's the chiyuv to do. And it's interesting, as we'll see, I've heard it asked a couple of times, there's a lot of people who say that there's a mitzvah to do kiruv rechokim. Where does it say in the Torah that you're supposed to do kiruv rechokim? Is that if actually a mitzvah? We'll get to some of the sources here, but this right here, what we're learning now, obviously, is one of the places, and as we'll see in a moment, in a particular pasuk coming up that we have an affirmative duty not to be mitalem, not to ignore our fellow Jews, but to do what we can to bring them back to Hashem, bring the sheep back to their Father in heaven, our brother. Okay, so he writes, "V'chein taseh lechamaro, v'chein taseh l'simlaso." It says that the pasuk further says that not only do we have to do this for the ox, but also for some easier things. You're supposed to do it for his donkey, much easier to deal with than an ox. V'chein taseh l'simlaso, or to his cloak, his article of clothing. What is that about? So the Or HaChaim saying on this, continuing this homiletic level, it's not just talking about he's lost, that our fellow has lost his way in off the derech, but perhaps sometimes he's also chamaro, his chomer, his material needs. If his material needs, he doesn't have enough money, he doesn't have his resources. Try to help him. He doesn't have, he isn't dressed properly, right? We're supposed to try to do what we can to help, and that's in fact even the person who we saw in the next pasuk who has his animal has fallen on the way. We shouldn't ignore them. We should do what we can to help them, right? All these things come together. But that says Or HaChaim that we need to not stand to the side and ignore it, or to think that I can't deal with this guy, right? We try to do what we can, but it has to be somebody who's emo, who at least shows some respect for what we're trying to do. If a person is completely off, then we don't have to do that. So that's what the Or HaChaim has to say about these psukim, which is a beautiful teaching. Minchas Chinuch says, Od mischayev al lo saseh de lo saman al dam re'echa. And another thing that we learned from this mitzvah of lo saman al dam re'echa, the lo gara, and it's not any less important than the simple part is, it is that, and we learned it from what it says in our Parsha here, v'hashevoso lo. One is supposed to, it says that when you return something, you're supposed to return it to him. So the pasuk says, what does that mean? V'hashevoso lo. The Gemara says, the l'rabos avedas gufo, that even if the person was physically going to be lost, that besides the mitzvah of lo saman al dam re'echa, there's also the mitzvah of v'hashevoso lo, which teaches us that we're supposed to help the person not lose something of themselves physically. So says the Minchas Chinuch, if that is so, alachas kama v'kama, or how much more so, if he could save the person from sinning, because that is a total loss of their not only of their body, of their spirit, not only in this world, the next world. Alachas kama v'kama, certainly, Rachmana litzlan, we should help such a person. It's our obligation to help that person. Again, a clear indication that there's an actual mitzvah, or several mitzvahs in the Torah, and there are some others that I've heard cited for the mitzvah of Kiruv Rechokim, the mitzvah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha, the mitzvah of Shema Yisrael, other types of things which give us an obligation not to just v'hisalamta mehem, to say, can ignore the rest of the Jewish people. That it's important for us to do what we can to go out and at the very least, be a good example, so that when people see from people, they'll see that as an attractive way of life, something to admire, and not something to look at very negatively. There are many more examples that Rav brought in the original Shir, a tshuva of the Marish Dam, and other things. I won't go into all of those. I'll keep this, like I said, short. I'll just mention one thing that the Lubavitcher Rebbe said. That he said that the Pnimius, the inner parish of Lo Saman al Dam Re'echa, is of course this, because Dam hu hanefesh, he says, because it's a well-known idea that that in many places that blood represents the soul. So la saman al dam re'echa, don't stand by when the soul of your reya is in danger. And then he extends that to the idea that which many Hasidic rabbis taught, that if you happen to experience something in your life, Baal Shem Tov has many stories like this. They would tell people, if you saw this thing that didn't happen by accident, HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Hashgacha Pratis wanted you to experience because you had something to learn from it or you had something to do about it. So he says, if Hashem brings you into contact where you have a close association with a person who is not aware of their heritage, is not aware of the spiritual grandeur that they were born with, is not aware of the opportunity that presents itself as Ashreinu Matov Chalkenu, how fortunate we are, that we are heirs to the great traditions of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Then you were shown that for a reason, that you're supposed to try to do what you can to help that person. So we see here, bringing it back to where we started, right, where a lot of times, we tend to talk about the great problems of Klal Yisrael, and we don't focus enough on the individuals that are in front of us. It's nice to say in general, there's kiruv out there, people are doing things out there. What are we doing? How are we involved? How about the individual Jews that we see, not just Klal Yisrael, but Reb Yisrael, to try to do what we can, each of us, to help and bring together Am Yisrael, to bring that, so to speak, as the Or HaChaim so beautifully said, the sheep back to its owner, the Hashivosolo, to bring the person back to themselves. And of course, all of the mitzvahs, the many mitzvahs in Parshas KiTetztze, all of them, as the Slanim Rebbe often says, the Taryag mitzvahs are Taryag Eitzos, that the 613 mitzvahs are 613 pieces of advice or ways in which that we can come closer to Hashem. That we have to, it's our job as much as we can to open ourselves to the possibilities around us and to the people that we're with, and not to be mitalem, not to let it go. It's easy to get caught up in all the political discussions and the finger pointing, and this one isn't doing it right, and that one isn't doing right. If more and more from Jews weren't so worried about that, but more worried about being a good example to others and reaching out to others in a positive way and showing them how good it is to lead a Torah lifestyle, what a beautiful set of values that we had. That's certainly the most important thing that we have, and that as we go now into Elul and coming closer to Rosh Hashanah and asking for Hashem's help to get us out of so many problems that we're with, if we do our best to help Hashem's children, we can hopefully ask Hashem that He should help Himself, so to speak, take care of His children and bring us finally to the Gula Shlema. Im Hera B'Yameinu.